Hi, everybody, and welcome to our very first colloquium of the semester. I'm Dr. Anna Stur, the director of the Center for South Asian Studies at UH Manoa, and all of us at the center are very, very pleased to be hosting this virtual colloquium on understanding Afghanistan, historical and ethnographic perspectives. The colloquium coincides with the opening of an exhibit on Afghanistan in UH Manoa's Hamilton Library. This exhibit features items pertaining to Afghanistan and its history from the library's own collection, and also photographs from the AP photographer Anya Nidringhaus, who died in Afghanistan in 2014. The exhibit has been made possible through support from the library and the Center for South Asian Studies, and the hard work and creative ideas of the curators, Asia Collection librarians Monica Kush, Karen Kaduhirer-Lauer, and Patricia Polanski. We invite those of you who can to visit the exhibit in person, and others to take a look at the summary of the exhibit on the library's website. If you are here in Oahu, we are very, very happy to announce that non-UH affiliated visitors are actually able to visit the exhibit now. And there's a way to do that, which we've shared on our social media and on our website. I can tell you now what it is, and then you can look on the website to get the details. But what you have to do is to complete a request a research appointment form on the library's website. That's Hamilton Library's website. And then you have to follow all the campus protocols of masking, social distance, and Lumicite app clearance for being on campus. So you can find further information about this, all of these ways to get to the exhibit and the exhibit itself on our website, and also on the website of the library. And I'm very, very excited. This exhibit opens today in conjunction with this colloquium. So hopefully we'll have many other avenues for learning about Afghanistan and seeing what the library's collections have to offer and what the photographs from Anya Nidringhaus can show and tell us about Afghanistan over the last 2 decades. Now moving on to the topic of our colloquium. In an article on Monday in Foreign Affairs, Afghan economist Ajmal Ahmadi offers his informed perspective in an insider's account of why Afghanistan recently fell to the Taliban. After putting forth his many arguments, he writes in conclusion, "We will undoubtedly debate the reasons for the Afghan state's quick collapse and cast blame for a long time to come. Understanding what led to its rapid downfall will, eventually, allow others to learn from our experience and formulate appropriate policy responses. In the meantime, the consequences will be borne yet again by Afghan citizens who had no say in any of these matters." This colloquium today is meant to give all of us more of a starting point to understand the situation of these very Afghan citizens and how they have been and continue to be caught in global plays of power and their connections to very local dynamics. I now have the great pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists, Dr. Abdul Karim Khan, Dr. Jimmy Weir, and Ms. Kim Gamble. The webinar will proceed, the colloquium will proceed in this way. Each of them will give about a 20-minute presentation, and then in the end, we will have some time for questions. So if you have questions, I ask you to put them in the chat and we will keep track of them. And also you'll be able to raise your hand and ask questions at the end, but please do save your questions to after all of the panelists have given their presentations. Thank you. Our first speaker is Dr. Abdul Karim Khan. Dr. Abdul Karim Khan was born and educated in Peshawar, the Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan. After receiving master's degrees in British literature and South Asian history from the University of Peshawar and another master's degree in European diplomatic history from Eastern Washington University, Dr. Khan, had the honor of getting his PhD in modern South Asian history under the late Professor Jagdish Sharma at the Department of History, UH Manoa. His doctoral dissertation chronicles the struggle of a Gandhi-inspired Pashtun nationalist movement of Abdul Ghaffar Khan in the Northwest Frontier province of British India between 1927 and 1947. Dr. Khan teaches courses in world history, Asian history, Islamic civilization, and history of international terrorism in the University of Hawaii's Leeward Community College. He has been following the rise and fall and now again the rise of Taliban since 1996. Dr. Khan is currently making modifications to his doctoral manuscript for publication with Oxford University Press. He is also preparing for publication another book-length manuscript, which is also entitled Understanding Afghanistan. He hopes and rather prays hard both of his books will be out in a year or two.
So this is going to be a quick rundown in the history of Afghanistan through what happened to the rulers of Afghanistan, and beginning with the 20th century. I don't want to go to the 19th century because I would never be able to come out of it. So I kept it to the 20th and 21st century. All right. All right. Just to give you the, ethnic confusion of Afghanistan and the borders. Right now, you should be worrying for what is the east, south, and southwest. That's the Pashtun hinterland between Pakistan and Afghanistan. A group of Pashtun ethnic group, you are looking at one of them, me. 20 million of us in Pakistan and about 12 million of us in Afghanistan, same culture, same language, with a little bit dialectical, variation and all that. And that place has been like in constant warfare for about at least 40 years. So that's one big thing when you talk about Afghanistan, the Pashtun hinterland. Almost all Taliban are Pashtun, but thank God not all Pashtuns are Taliban. So to make that clarification, the vast majority of them are Pashtun. Now they have also got the interest and the benefits of other ethnic groups, especially Tajik. So let's get out of and go to, okay. So all this stuff, for the United States, as we know it, started with 9/11 attacks. The Al-Qaeda attacks on the United States, we know that. And then in retaliation, of course, United States, attacked Afghanistan and occupied it. And here are some of the Taliban fighters caged, jailed, captured, and almost all of them are now, out of jail. Some of them by design by United States and some of them, by the Taliban. And so they have joined the ranks. They have taken the entire, country, Afghanistan again, after fighting American native forces for 20 years, just like Anna said, what went wrong, why the United States, had to withdraw, and what is going to be next. All right, just to give you the complexity of the problem, and we look at the head, not at the bottom of Afghanistan, and we start with the head of the states, what happened to them, then you can, guess and imagine what would be going on the ground. So starting from the 20th century, right there in the beginning of the 20th century, a king is Amir Habibullah Khan, very strong person, assassinated. We're not going to go into details why. Everybody has their own reason why, one was killed, the other was driven out. Here is my ideal king of Afghanistan, Amanullah Khan. He had to flee the country because he won, a very good program, a liberal, progressive program for Afghanistan. And so he had to flee because the religious leadership did not like him. So here is the next king of Afghanistan, very strong man, assassinated. His brother was attacked in Germany. He survived, but himself killed. Here is the king, the long, lasting king of Afghanistan. On the right side, you see him with John F. Kennedy, and he wanted to reach out to United States and have good relationship. he was deposed by his own brother-in-law, who was his like an advisor, and that brother-in-law is right here, Dawood Khan, the president who became the president, and he was assassinated. Now, with that started the communist period in Afghanistan. So the Communist Party called the PDA, the People Democratic, Party of Afghanistan, they came into power, communist, and established themselves in power, killed the president of Afghanistan. And so here is the leader. He also was assassinated by rival communists. That led to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which continued, and occupation continued from 1979 to 1989. This period, the communist occupation of Afghanistan, led to all the present problems that you have in Afghanistan. So there started a huge, big anti-Soviet jihad, holy war by the Afghans. Right here, more and more Soviets are coming with their tanks and all that, and rounding up people in the streets and places, And so this was this anti-Soviet jihad, holy war of the Afghan Mujahideen, so to speak, was blessed by United States. Here are the leaders of the Mujahideen sitting with Ronald Reagan, the president at that time, and millions of dollars were given to them. All sorts of weaponry was given to them, And so that was a very successful jihad that turned Afghanistan, in the words of Brzezinski, into a Vietnam for the Soviets. What happened to the Americans in Vietnam, now the Americans were doing to the Soviets in Afghanistan. So hence the terminology Vietnamization of Afghanistan for the Soviets. All right, very successful, to be honest with you. And they did, kick the Soviets out of Afghanistan after fighting very successfully for 10 years. This jihad created its own leaders, and one of them is right here, Ahmad Shah Massoud, a wonderful commander, wonderful leader, wonderful man. We can talk about him, more later, but keep in mind that each jihad, almost every decade created its own people who rose up, and a lot of them went down. So the leadership is very much tied to the military and the warfare that was going on in Afghanistan. Right here, some of the Mujahideen fighting the Soviets, and some Soviets were captured. Now, when we say some Soviets, there are no statistics, but the American sources tell us there were in thousands. For the first time after Second World War, any Soviet soldier was arrested, captured outside Soviet Union, and these were then released to their families, of course, like hostages, and the families had to pay to the Mujahideen leaders to get their boys out of Afghanistan. So that's, what happened to the Soviets. The next, the communist president, the second one, Hafizul Amin, highly educated person, PhD from Columbia, assassinated by rival communists. He belonged to the Parcham, and his Khalq faction assassinated. This person was lucky. He fled to Moscow well in time and saved himself, a full-fledged president of Afghanistan, popular among the Pashtun people, but not so among the Tajik communists. Then came another Pashtun, Dr. Najibullah, the last communist president. He had very good time. Soviets helped him, but then they withdrew their help. And finally, he was hanged by the Taliban in 1996. This type of a jihad going on brought a group of people, the Mujahideen, and so there is sort of a decade of everybody. So this criminal rule of the communists from 1978, 1992, the murderous rule of the Mujahideen, they came to power, and killed a lot of people. Then the terrible rule of the Taliban from 1996 to 2001. Had the Al-Qaeda attacks not happened, the 9/11, they might have been, who knows, for a long time in power. Then the NATO American, operations from 20 years, and then happened the Trump-Taliban treaty in February 2020. And that brought, the Taliban now to power. I call them new Taliban, and to suggest differences between the new Taliban and the old style Taliban. This was a very popular, great religious leader. He became the president, unfortunately not acceptable, to people. And so he had to quit because there was just too much violence. Another very popular president, popular in the sense of highly religious person, he was assassinated by the Taliban, and so later on, here come, during this period from 1996 to 2001, you have on the right, the one-eyed sort of man, the real original founding father of the Taliban, his left hand, on the left, in the middle, a sort of a co-founder also, Mullah Mansour. He was killed in a drone attack, and Mullah Umar, he died, we don't know really when, but quite a few years. And on the extreme left, you have Al-Qaeda leader, Osama bin Laden. He was killed in 2011 in Pakistan. So as you see, quite, leaders from this jihad, upstarted their careers, some local and some international, as Osama bin Laden especially. And here is his work of the 9/11, Osama bin Laden, the terrorist attacks of Al-Qaeda, United States, invasion of Afghanistan, and then occupation for 20 years, the Taliban back. So after the Taliban were driven out in 2000 to 2014, United States kept this person in power, a fellow Pashtun, very popular among some, but not really acceptable to others. But he managed to, rule the country for 14 years, very popular with the Republicans, so to speak, with the Bush administration, but not so with the Obama administration. So there was, that type of problem also. Here is the last president, supported by United States, of course, for quite some time, 2 terms, in office. He had to flee the country the day Taliban entered on August 15 this year, 2021. And Trump called him, a total crook. And as they say, it takes a crook to know a crook. So right there. Okay, so that, as I said, Karzai had very good relationship with President Bush, but not so with Obama. And now we are back to Taliban, who recaptured Kabul on August 15, 2021 without a shot, and I really expected a big massacre there, but no. The president fled, and people just surrendered like that. The military was there, the army garrison in Kabul were there. If you go to the palace where the president lives, it's not too far away from the US embassy in Kabul, and so that whole place is full of, the Americans, full of Afghan soldiers, what we call the Afghan National Army, a lot of units, intelligence and all that. And it's just unbelievable that all of them just dropped dead, did not, shoot at any Talib or Taliban, and they just surrendered. And they're still working for under the Taliban. That's just amazing. The police system completely collapsed in the sense that they would not, shoot anyone. And so that's how, the Taliban are back in power after 20 years struggle against the United States, or fighting against the United States. Okay, so right here, they are in office on the left. This is the palace. If you go inside the palace, you would see exactly this. This is the one room that the president used to use for conferences and all that. And now there is the Taliban sitting in his seat. In the streets, you have Taliban. This is a daily, type of a sort of a scene on the right. You see Taliban buzzing around, in the streets, and not only just in Kabul, but last night when I watched, I don't know if you watched last night PBS program, the taking over of Kabul by the Taliban. There was from 9 to 10 1-hour program frontline, and they're still there with the same pickup and the same guns and the same. Most of these guns, the Taliban have. These are U.S. made, given to the Afghan army. They surrendered, and the Taliban heavily, armed. So this is sort of their government scheme. These are the ministers, and the most interesting minister is the Minister of Interior, Sirajuddin Haqqani. This person is wanted by FBI. Still, there is more than $5 million on his head. If you can find him, in Kabul, he's right there. I know everybody knows, you will get $5 million rich. And so that's the different people, and all of them, they share only one thing, and all of them religious leaders. The most important person right now is this one, Mullah Abdul Ghani, brother with whom the Americans had to deal and struck, a deal during the Trump administration. On the top, you have the figure, Amir al-Mu'mineen, the figurehead of the whole movement of Taliban, but this is the most important person. However, there is a rift between him and Mullah Hassan Akhund, the prime minister, and so people are hoping that they would get into trouble among themselves, and that would give some relief to Afghanistan or to United States and other people. Okay, I think I finished it in less than 10 minutes, right?
Dr. Khan, you have 4 minutes left if you would like to continue speaking and elaborate on anything.
Okay, I will if I can get out of it. So everybody can hear me, right?
Yeah.
And I hope everybody cannot see.
Here, I'll stop it for you.
Okay, you
there.
did?
And you can share your video too, maybe.
Okay, so I'm not sharing my screen anymore, right?
You're not.
Okay, great. So what I'm saying here in sort of a historical perspective, each period, if you go by decade or 2 decades, you will have a major problem in the country. But here is a very interesting thing. Most of this stuff happens in the capital of Kabul, the capital city of Kabul. If you go like maybe 50 miles away at the most, or the greatest place on planet Earth, at that time, now it's nothing, the Bagram, airport where you had, all the Americans there. If you go even 20 miles to any site of Bagram airport and 50 miles of the capital city of Kabul, boy, life goes on fine. Fine in the sense that people are doing their agriculture activities. Afghanistan is subsistence agriculture. You have to do, whatever you can to get, yank anything out of the land. And so that is going on. On the one side, in the countryside, believe me, people have more food than the cities now. So there are people right now, as we speak in Kabul, in tents, hungry, really hungry. And outside in the countryside, you do have, villages, people, they have their land, their agriculture activities going on, their children, everything, And so cities are more in trouble, especially the capital of Kabul, compared to any other countryside. So there's a very interesting thing going on. The WHO and the United Nations, they came up like last month even with this very grim assessment. There would be so many, millions of children would die of starvation. So that could be just possible within the cities. Outside the cities, maybe not. However, anything can happen in terms of the COVID. And when you see the crowds inside Kabul, you think there's no COVID there, no mask, no nothing, forget about, the Trump, meetings at Mount Rushmore, nobody had at that time, any mask, and now nobody use any mask or anything as if there is no COVID there. So that's, another, dangerous thing that is happening in that country. There are no statistics, how many people die. Hospitals, especially in the cities, are almost with nothing. The last night program on Frontline PBS, it showed, people going to Pakistan, and Pakistan has closed its own border with Afghanistan, for medical, reasons. Pakistan not allowing them, if they don't have the right type of documents. So that's another, problem going on over there. So far the countryside is concerned, my sources tell me things are okay. There is amazingly, and this is the greatest, interesting irony, and I would also call it tragedy, believe me or not, on the ground. If you ask people, especially the merchant class, boy, they're so happy with the Taliban coming in power. For simple reason why we would pay tax now only to one group of people, the Taliban, and not to all these warlords and all these gangs and other people, from Kabul to Kunduz. It's not a huge, big country like United States or, going from one side of Russia to another side. Just making this trip from Kabul to Kunduz up north and then to crossing the border into Central Asia, the Tajir, the trading community, the business community had to pay, enormous bribes to the local warlords. And so it's just, tragic. I'll call it really tragedy that the business class is very happy with the Taliban. So when Pakistan opens its border, they would be very happy, going to Pakistan, and then even beyond Pakistan to Afghanistan. That's the only route for them to get to India. And so that's one thing. The mullahs are very happy, the religious classes are very happy, the Taliban in power, and that gives more power to the religious community in the country. So the trading people, the policemen, they're, they hope that they would get back their money that the previous regime did not pay them in 4 months. So that the one thing that I believe can go wrong for Taliban and that group, that one factor is women in the country. Believe me, it's very tall claim if I would say that the Taliban are more worried, for the women than the warlords. Because women have the eyes and the ears of almost every foreign country. Watching the Taliban, what they're doing to women, they have stopped, no question about it, women from going to work. Even though Taliban, Zabiullah Mujahid, especially the spokesperson, says, no, we don't have any restriction on any woman. That's not true. Just the fear itself is a big restriction using against the women, and so they cannot. Previously, you could see in Kabul anytime, a lot of women in burqa, without burqa, in chadar, without chadar, just scarf, and even sometimes no scarf. Those ladies, especially from the Pashtun TV stations like Shamshad, particularly Shamshad, they have started wearing the scarf. There were ladies who, did not want to wear the scarf, and they are without scarf. On Tulu News, which is like the CNN, the 24-hour, 724-hour TV channel in Afghanistan, there you have much more, modesty now you see with women wearing the scarf. One lady who wanted to, in the beginning, like in the second week of August, she wanted to interview the Taliban leader, and the Taliban leader agreed to be interviewed sitting across from her being completely unveiled and no, no scarf or anything. And she interviewed him, which suggested to some people that, the Taliban have changed. Otherwise, previously, no Talib would sit across from a lady without a scarf and being interviewed on TV. And so that when that happened, people were cheering up, okay, Taliban have changed. But that lady fled the country, next week. for fearing, that she used that program as a propaganda, and so she fled the country. So it's a sort of a mixed thing in Kabul University itself. Anna, you can start me anytime you want. Okay.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Dr. Khan.
Okay.
This is all very, very fascinating, and I hope we have
Okay.
more time to ask you
Okay.
questions and get more of the
Definitely.
details of everything you know. But thank you
Especially
so
about
much.
especially about Kabul University. I
Okay,
would like to say something
yes.
because we are in the university setting with students.
Okay, can we, would you like to say that now real quick, or would you like to wait? If we can give you 2
Just
minutes.
wait,
Oh,
because
okay,
Jim is
perfect.
ready.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Khan. Now we'll move to our next speaker. I'm very, very pleased to introduce Dr. Jimmy Weir. Jimmy Weir has a PhD in cultural anthropology from the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. His dissertation, We Went to the Hills: 4 Afghan Life Stories, uses life narrative to examine the historical experiences and emotional legacies of the Afghan-Soviet War. His interest in this region began nearly 25 years ago when he was based as a Peace Corps volunteer teacher at a residential college in Balochistan province in Pakistan. After this, he worked for 2 years on a UN IOM Afghan repatriation project. In 2004 and 5, he conducted cultural anthropology fieldwork based in Kabul. In July 2011, he returned to Honolulu from Kabul after a year of research and report writing for an Afghan NGO to direct the Muslim Societies in Asia and the Pacific program here at UH Manoa. He has published on Afghan culture, security, and insurgency in Foreign Policy, The Diplomat, Christian Science Monitor, and the Economics and Security Journal. And we are very, very lucky to have Dr. Jimmy Weir with us today. So thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you. And thank you, Karim. I hope and I think our presentations may complement each other well, in that I'm attempting to focus more, same period, similar interests, but I'm interested in exploring how ordinary Afghans understood periods of conflict, particularly the Soviet-Afghan conflict. And I do this with the issue I think everybody so far has brought up. We're inevitably asking, what would cause the US to retreat after a 20-year conflict? And why was the Taliban able to take control so quickly? And I try to focus on how ordinary Afghans, as I've either known them in my life or have interviewed people while I was doing my research, and then continue as my PhD dissertation research. And to this day, like, what is it that ordinary Afghan sensibilities indicate about why and how the conflict evolved the way it did? And so I'd like to think I'm addressing the issue of why the US left in the way that they had to leave, but without directly addressing it. So I'm trying to hear what Afghans have said about conflicts in the past or their present at the time that I was speaking to them. So I think, I hope, and we're complementing each other, I think, in a nice way. I'm not a historian, but I do wish to engage the biggest pictures of recent Afghan history over 3 centuries in a way. And so I've chosen to focus today on 2 phrases to sort of focus the historical analysis or thinking and a phrase that is what I'm going to call cultural or ethnographic, and that is, we went to the hills. And I'll explain a little bit why I focus on the second one. The first one is just a way historians have in recent years frequently referred to the country. And let me ask one thing, Anna, is my screen or visible in a way that is going to work? I know it's a little different than what we set up.
Your screen is currently not being shared.
I'm glad I asked. All right. So share screen, there we go. How's that?
It's good. It's no longer in the way that it was set up.
I know. Something
Okay.
happened while we were speaking. I had to come out of it and restart it.
Okay.
Does this look like it's going to work?
What you might want to do is drag it so it takes up the entire screen so we don't see your entire email.
Okay. I was just figuring out how to do that. Yeah. 1 second.
Okay. Excellent.
All right. So I'm going to come back to this, but one way I want to approach this is as I was interviewing, well, as I spoke to Afghans, both before I was doing my dissertation work and then as I did field work, I found Afghans frequently said, explaining the Soviet-Afghan war, that we went to the hills very casually, like a trope. It was just very, very common to say we went to the hills. I start with this picture in part because, these are hills right outside where I interviewed some of the people I'll discuss in a bit. And, inevitably, if you look at the landscape, you ask, like, how did you go to the hills? How is that possible? Which is a practical question in a way. And how is it that there is a way in Afghan culture that it's readily understood that circumstances may occur in which it will be necessary to go to the hills, and people have a phrase that quickly identifies what that is about. So we went to the hills as my way of going, this is what ordinary Afghans say about what happened, what they did, and what they do when circumstances push them to this point. So I found that a very interesting thing. And as I did my dissertation research, I focused on the Soviet-Afghan war. I didn't materially ask, how did you survive day to day in the hills? I still don't know exactly how to grasp what day-to-day life was, but there is an understanding that this might be necessary at times. And I think it starts to point to this larger historical phrase, the graveyard of empires. So I will try to quickly go over my work, my Peace Corps experience quickly, to suggest some aspects of daily life, and then go into what the graveyard of empires is pointing to. And then I'll focus on 3 individuals, and I'm just going to mostly read quotes from interviews I've done with them. I might comment on them a little bit, but I'd like to think that often they speak for themselves. So I'm not going to try to explain the quotes at much length. So my work, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in 1990 to 92. I was in a Pashtun region of Balochistan, as Karim pointed to. The Pakistan side of the Pashtun region is large, and I was in a region where there were Pashtun, ethnically Pashtun, albeit in the Pakistan side. From here, I joined UNHCR and IOM on a repatriation program for about 2 years. And I was moving and working with Afghans who were returning to Afghanistan after being refugees in Pakistan for a very long period of time. And that's kind of where this interest on We Went to the Hills got, shaped. I would meet refugees in camps, and we would work out their return plans. The UN and IOM were helping to fund transportation and assist as they could, and I was negotiating those interactions. But I would inevitably talk to people about their experiences. Afghans are famously hospitable. I was frequently invited into houses, and this phrase kept coming up. People would tell me their experiences of leaving during the Soviet-Afghan war. And so when I ended up eventually doing PhD research, I focused on that period. 2004 to 5 is when I did a lot of the interviews I'll come back to later. I then came back in 2010 and I did research for an Afghan NGO that was focused on political dynamics in the South. This is probably when the conflict was the hottest. And ultimately, the Afghan NGO was working for the Canadian embassy, which was providing information to the Canadian military and inevitably, I'm sure, the US military. But I kind of watched how people were collecting information, and it was very troubling because I could read reports that contradicted themselves a lot. And I knew that people were sending us information from the field that really was not very well researched, documented, or frequently just invented. But that's a little aside. And then for a period, I worked on articles with usually Afghan friends, largely on the Taliban, and a lot on Taliban funding sources. Okay, I'm jumping back now. So here's my Peace Corps, Peace Corps days. I do this for two reasons, just to say what life was like for me amongst a lot of young students at a school, and also to say the connections I made were super rich. I am very in touch with many of these students to this day. And I think their maintenance of a relationship with me over all this time is the indication of something interesting. I don't know I know hardly anyone from high school at this point in my life. It would never occur to me to remain in contact with a teacher from that period. No doubt I was a little unusual as an American in this area, but they're doing this with the teachers they had at the time, as I will be able to show you. So here's some of my students from that period. A thing I want to circle around is this tremendous respect people in this region of this culture have for education. So here are my students. These students, when I walked into the room, would inevitably stand up, like without thinking. They'd stand at attention until I asked them to sit. And they were typical kids in that, they were mischievous at times, and there were a host of personalities that frankly resembled personalities I understood in the US. There were geeks and jocks and, funny kids. I mean, there's clearly cultural differences, but in many ways, just really ordinary kids that, I worked with for 2 years and I continue to hear from frequently. A photo of a field trip we did at the time. Here's the faculty and staff at the school. When I arrived at the school, there were 120 kids. The school had just begun, and there were 3 faculty responsible for the kids 24 hours a day. It was a residential school. Now, 3/4 of the people you see here are administrative. There were really just 4 or 5 teachers who felt their responsibility was for how the kids were doing day to day. It was understaffed. Nevertheless, it worked, very well. Coincidentally, just a few days ago, they had an alumni homecoming. So basically, they're honoring here these 2. This was the principal of the school at the time, and this was a teacher I was very, very friendly with, Muhammad Ali, both of whom have died. And again, there's this like maintenance of a relationship and a respect and appreciation for teachers from 25 years ago, honored 25 years after they were taught by these students. And I think that's important. I think some part of understanding how these wars went is the nature of social relations over time. Here, these are my students 25 years later at that event. I just coincidentally got these pictures because I maintained contact. And, it's kind of neat. These are faces I knew when they were quite a bit younger. I got a message that I think is pretty cool. Sir, your students are now grown up, serving on senior responsible government and private sector positions across the country and abroad. Thank you for your valuable contribution. I don't put this up as a, self-promotion. I think they would say the same thing to many of their teachers from that period. There's a continuing respect for the fact that we taught them and hopefully did it reasonably well. And I would just make 3 notes from that. Tremendous respect for education. Many of my interviews amongst Afghans, these are in Pakistan, and these kids admittedly are from generally affluent families. This was a very good school I was teaching at. In Afghanistan, as I do interviews, the degree to which people's inability to pursue an education because of conflict comes up over and over again and is you know, repeated and emphasized and stressed. I'm curious about the cementing of social relationships. I think that's an important aspect of understanding Afghan history and Afghan culture. And I think part of why I say this is to indicate that they do and how they've done it in ways that I've seen it. And then I'd add Taliban means student. And Karim, you know, please at any point correct me. But it may mean specifically religious student. I think it does. And many of the Taliban in Afghanistan were young Afghans who left Afghanistan because they couldn't get an education. And in Pakistan, they could, frequently at madrasas. So this is at least one part of their evolution. I'll go through this kind of quickly because Karim has done it. I thought it would be useful to just make sure we all can locate Afghanistan effectively and recognize the countries that are around it, because unless this is something you focus on. So for example, I think if you were not interested in Afghanistan, you probably wouldn't suspect that China here in this corner shares a small border with Afghanistan. And I would just say the borders of this country have been shaped by other major powers. And much of Afghan history is best explained by the interventions of external powers on the country. This border is a product of the British colonial project in South Asia, attempts to take control over Afghanistan, and notably failures. So part of this idea of a history of defeating empires begins in that period. The northern border is the extent to which the Russian Empire was able to reach, and again, stopped at the Afghan border and stopped, and I can't go into this, but it's super interesting, because of their failure to take control over Afghanistan, and their interest was due to the fact that they were concerned about each other. So these borders are a product of a 19th century conflict between two superpowers at that time, and their failure to get beyond these borders. So countries landlocked, it's located between South Asia and Central Asia, kind of precisely. People, I find academics have a hard time putting the country in one region or the other. It's landlocked, roughly the size of Texas. There's an enormous mountain range that's very relevant to the war and the way the country's history has evolved, especially in the past, in the 19th century. This mountain range, the Hindu Kush, is essentially the end of the Himalayan mountains. So when there weren't planes and motorized vehicles, this flat region became a place where the Russians and the British thought they would meet in conflict. It's poor, very little infrastructure. Karim showed us this as well. I think the main thing is to say it's an ethnically diverse country. The largest group is Pashtuns, Tajiks, Turkmen, Uzbek, Hazara, all sizable populations. Sorry. So this notion of a graveyard of empires, I just want to acknowledge the fact that in the 19th century, something dubbed the Great Game was this tension between the Russians and the British. And in that, probably the Great Game, I think, is the most defining geopolitical tension of the 19th century. And in that period, the British lose 3 wars, including the largest defeat they've had in colonial history. They draw the line, the Durand Line, which is the border with Pakistan today. They separate India from Afghanistan. They divide Pashtuns, not quite in half, but roughly, and they create tribal areas. This region is very important to the 2 wars that follow. The largest British loss in colonial history, as I understood it, is the Battle of Gandamark. The British were tricked into a narrow valley. The Afghans fought from well above a very large group of Brits that were trying to leave Kabul, and all of them were killed except for one. I most assume that was intentional. He was a medical doctor. He was left so he could report what had happened in Peshawar. I do want to say as an aside, I don't mean to suggest there's something omnipotent or, you know, it's incredibly powerful or incredibly capable in war amongst Afghans. It might sound like that. I want to say something a little smaller. There's something about the way in which Afghans communicate that enable them to persevere, and the fact is they've succeeded. Like, why is a question people will be asking for a long time. The Cold War in the late 20th century is the conflict between the US and the Soviet Union, and both attempting to have geopolitical dominance over much of the rest of the world. And the Soviet-Afghan War becomes a defining moment in this major political tension, probably the largest of the late 20th century. And it occurs across the globe, but a very important battle zone was in Afghanistan when the Soviets and the Afghan resisting the communist government fought. I'd say one of the most important things to keep in mind out of all of this is during that period, 1.5 million Afghans died. That is roughly 1 in 10. 2/3 are displaced from their homes, most multiple times. 1/3 of the entire country is in another country, primarily Pakistan and Iran. So when we think about Afghan culture, as much as I'm suggesting this history is relevant, I also wish to say probably the most defining aspect of Afghan culture today is the fact that this war occurred, and the violence and this uprooting that occurred during that period is kind of hard to relate to. I mean, I think it's useful to bring these things back to a context we understand. Imagine 1 in 10 Americans dying in a conflict that occurs in our country while 2/3 are placed and 1/3 are refugees. It's disruptive. And in a way, I don't wish to suggest there's some eternal Afghan sensibility. I think, and I say that in part because I find many of the political pundits do. They tend to say, you know, that it's always been like this, conflicts, you know, endemic to Afghanistan, and there's traditional ways that just maintain themselves indefinitely. No, I think big powers get involved and mess things up, and Afghans respond. Afghan culture isn't irrelevant. Probably more relevant is the history of other powers intervening in the country. Soviets withdraw in 1989. The Soviet Union breaks up in 92, and I happen to be finishing Peace Corps. So I'm asked to, you know, I'm able to do this job with the UN, working with Afghans who are returning back to Afghanistan. And I think I probably learned the most during that period because I traveled a lot and could speak to a lot of different people outside of any particular goal than to assist their return home. So here's some images of the Soviet-Afghan War. The Mujahideen are the name, I believe it roughly translates as Islamic warrior. But it's the name for the groups that were resisting the Soviet and Afghan communist government. There were 7 major parties. It was a long, bloody war, and in the end, the Russians left. Okay, so, and then, sorry, jumping ahead here, Graveyard of Empires. I want to say something has happened just recently. To begin with, I'd say the war on terror then could be the early 21st century moment in which the Afghans start to engage the largest geopolitical powers in the world, and in the end, they leave. So as I think we all know, and Karim has reviewed in like closer detail, the 9/11 attacks occur, the US invades. A point I want to make is the Taliban fall very quickly, like strikingly quickly. The Taliban rose in response to conflict between the Mujahideen parties very quickly. From 94 to 95, they went from almost non-existent to in power. They fell very quickly. And as we saw, they rose, they just rose again very quickly. This is just a fact. I don't think we can explain it, but I think it needs to be a part of our analysis and thinking about this history. All right, so I want to go into 3 Afghan life stories that are collected in 2005. And I will say I traveled around the country at that point. I was doing life history interviews. I focused on the Soviet-Afghan War because I was interested, but also because as the 2005, the American war was, the American conflict in Afghanistan was just beginning to heat up. It was kind of a turning point. Until 2004, it seemed the war was mostly over. The Americans and the new Afghan government was in power, and it would seem that the conflict would largely subside. But around 2005, it starts to turn and gets more violent. And in return, the US brings more and more troops into the country, culminating in like over 100,000 in 2010. So I interview this man in 2005. Let me pull up my notes here. So his name is Ustad Muhammad Alam. He's from Bala, which is in western in Afghanistan. It's a very small town in a remote region. Ustad Muhammad Alam was a communist as a young man, and that becomes a big part of his life story. And I think that is because he is in a community in which most people were fighting for the Mujahideen. So he's now back in a position of power. He's at the only high school in the region. He's the principal, and most of his students are the children of people who fought for the Mujahideen. I find it very interesting that people are willing to go past a conflict that was so bloody and say, yeah, you're the most educated man around. We'd like to have you teach our kids. He, though, recognizes he's distrusted. He's in a bind between the fact that he has this past. Everybody knows it. This is a small community. And he still wishes to be a leader and influence his community. So with that as context, when I was a child, there was no war in Afghanistan, none whatsoever. Afghanistan was safe. This was the reign of King Zahir Shah, which is roughly 1933 to 1973. There really wasn't much conflict in Afghanistan during that period. But now, after so many years, I have not known peace in many years. In Kabul, I was a student. I found living conditions there very different from what I had known in Bala. He's a very good student, and he gets a scholarship to go to college, high school, I think, in Kabul. I was astonished to see young women going to school. Even more surprising was that we had female teachers. It shocked me. This didn't exist in Bala. I think this is a very telling statement. In short, okay, okay, I will try to. Anna, how much time would you suggest I have? Are you?
It is now 11:04 and we go till 11:30. So we'd like to be able to have Kim have her 20 minutes.
Okay.
This is all fascinating and I didn't want to cut you off.
That's all right. Should I speed through or wrap up with this fellow, or?
Why don't you keep telling us details on this fellow, and then maybe in questions you can introduce some of the other two if we have time.
All right.
Thank you.
Sure. So he says at one point in the interview, as he tries to tell a version of Afghan history in the early part of the interview as a kind of detached historian. In short, my time as a student was a time of slogans, of long live that and death to so-and-so, which I hear as a way of saying everybody was kind of at odds with each other and there's no ideological explanation at this point. I asked him, which side were you on? And I know that already, but I don't think he knows that. People in the room snicker, they know this is sensitive. He continues, well, there are two ways to get involved in a party. One is to be ideologically inclined and make informed and well-reasoned decisions. The second is to go along with the flow of things for the sake of partying with your buddies. I was unknowingly a Hulkie in the second. This is one of the two major communist parties. In fact, the school you're sitting in is full of Hulkies. I lead the school, I've gathered them. Why did you join them? Basically, I agreed with them. They were against the exploitation of the peasants, the poor. They were against the lords and the capitalists who were abusing everyone. I'm skipping now. But soon we saw the Russians betrayed us. Then we escaped, we went to the hills. I personally fought the Russians. He ends the interview saying he has great respect and appreciation for Western forces in the country. He compares himself to Madame Curie, saying, I'm working knowing that there are risks. My life is at stake, but I'm doing it for the greater good. And I'd suggest in his case, there's this tension between his community's knowledge of his past and his respect for the ideals and friendships he made during the communist period. And I think I'll stop there. All right, sorry if I went over.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. Dr. Weir, that was excellent. I really wish we could keep going. And without further ado, so as to leave time for everyone to discuss and for our final presenter to present all of her stuff, I would love to introduce our final presenter, Ms. Kim Gamble. Kim Gamble is a deputy editor for Honolulu Civil Beat. She came to Hawaii after many years abroad, most recently in Seoul, covering the Korean Peninsula for the military newspaper Stars and Stripes. She previously was a foreign correspondent for the Associated Press, with assignments in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Libya, Egypt, and elsewhere. A Russian major in college, she began her career as a reporter with an English language newspaper in Moscow, the Moscow Tribune, as the Soviet Union was starting to disintegrate. She later went to work for the Associated Press in Iowa, North Carolina, and New York, before being posted as the Nordic Baltic news editor in Sweden. A highlight of that period was going reindeer herding with indigenous Sami north of the Arctic Circle. A native of Idaho, Kim went to Bates College in Maine and has a master's degree from the Medill School of Journalism. She also was a 2015 Knight Wallace Fellow at the University of Michigan. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak here. It's great to talk to you all. Now, going last is always difficult because, of course, Drs. Khan and Weir covered a lot, but I'll go ahead and give it a try. I sent you my official bio, but I should really mention, kind of my specific focus on Afghanistan. I started traveling to Afghanistan in 2010, basically on 4 to 6 week assignments for the Associated Press. And my last trip there was in 2014 to cover the elections that brought Ashraf Ghani to power. And I'm sad to say that's also when, Anya Niedringhaus was killed. And so I'm very happy that you have some of her photos to highlight, because she was very skilled at capturing the humanity. And I think that, I'd encourage everybody to check those out. So I think that my predecessors have covered the history of Afghanistan quite well. So I'm going to focus mainly on, what I kind of know firsthand, which is Afghanistan's modern history, the 2 decades after the Taliban were overthrown in 2001. But a lot of what I'm going to be saying, won't take into account the current events. So bear that in mind. As the others have shown, Afghanistan is a beautiful and diverse country. despite having been at war for basically 4 decades. It's also full of contradictions. You know, I want to focus on a few specific topics, and in justifying its continued presence in Afghanistan after Al-Qaeda was ousted and Osama bin Laden was killed, American officials often cite women's rights and access to education as successes and as improvements. And I'd like to talk a little bit about those because it kind of reflects on the lives of Afghans right now and how they may be changing. As always, the story is more complicated than it appears, because when you talk about, you know, what Americans consider progress in Afghanistan, and you have to be careful about that because, as I said, Afghanistan is a very diverse country. So, you know, often when American officials are talking about that, they're talking about Kabul, you know. While there has been progress, I think that you can argue that gaps have widened between urban and rural communities, and the rural communities are deeply conservative and can seem frozen in time. And I think that this also goes partway to explain, you know, how the Taliban were able to seize power again so quickly. Obviously, Dr. Khan touched on this. That's also reflected, I think, in a constant tension between those who will fight to maintain longstanding traditions in Afghanistan and pro-Western modernizers. So I'd like to kind of tell an anecdote and jump to 2014 when the last elections in Afghanistan were being held. And the campaigning was pretty crazy because it almost seemed American style, you know, with candidates stumping for votes, giving people gifts, trying to get the women's vote out. And I want to talk about one candidate who I profiled, which was Dr. Habiba Sarabi. And she was running to be vice president for a minor candidate. And as I wrote at the time, during an event that I attended, she strode into a wedding hall packed with men and women, but the men were on one side, the women were on the other side, so they were still segregated. And she shook hands with the women, just nodded to the men. Dr. Sarabi was already well known because she was the first woman elected as governor of Bamiyan, which, if you follow Afghanistan, you know, I would mention is also the province that was the site of the giant Buddha statues that were blown up by the Taliban in 2001. That's just an aside. Her ticket lost, as we know. Ashraf Ghani won the election. But, you know, the mere act of campaigning was a major step forward for women. And in this particular election, women turned out in record numbers to vote and to run for office. Nearly that year, nearly 100 women won seats on provincial councils. And I mentioned that election, which was by no means perfect, but generally got good marks from international observers, because I want to talk about how, you know, the US presence has in so many ways changed life in Afghanistan over the past 20 years. And in so many ways hasn't, you know, especially when we go back to the divisions, such as many rural areas that remained under Taliban control and stuck to their traditions despite legal frameworks. But they remain largely outside of, unaffected by outside influence. So one of the clearest changes, as Dr. Sarabi exemplifies, was the role of women in a male-dominated and deeply conservative Muslim society. And since this is a historical presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the struggle for women's rights in Afghanistan, which actually began long before the Taliban, began their first rule in 1996. And Afghan women enjoyed freedoms before the Americans arrived. So I just want to make that clear. In the early 20th century, King Amanullah Khan tried to advance women's rights as part of a modernization campaign. His wife, Queen Soraya, is kind of considered the first, well, many told me that they considered her the first Afghan feminist. She opened the first girls' school in Kabul, and she famously removed her veil during a speech by her husband as horrified conservative tribal leaders looked on. This was in the early 20th century. However, those reform efforts didn't serve the royal couple well because they helped fuel an insurgency, and they were eventually overthrown. In 1964, there was a constitution that enshrined women's right to vote and run for public office, among other freedoms. But the status of women began to erode again after the country plunged into a civil war following the 1979 Soviet invasion. So any hope for equality was, of course, dashed when the Taliban seized control in 1996, barring women and girls from going to school or participating in any way in public life, or even leaving their homes unless escorted by a male relative. After the Taliban were overthrown, the US-backed interim government adopted a new constitution in 2004, and that restored women's right to vote and even, I guess American style, implemented quotas to ensure that they would be part of the political process, which they were in the years to come. This is a brief and very oversimplified historical overview. I apologize, Dr. Khan, for my oversimplification. But it's important to understand the context for what happened over the past 20 years and what's happening now. When I began traveling to Afghanistan in 2010, women were going to work, they were sitting in coffee houses and walked around without fear in Kabul. Nationwide, women joined the security forces and they became doctors, they became judges and journalists, of course. Some still wore the all-encompassing burqa, but it wasn't required. And most also still donned a hijab, a headscarf, which is a sign of modesty and a symbol of faith for Muslims. So young women and men attended classes together at universities. In fact, I remember seeing one couple holding hands as they walked on the campus outside Kabul University. And that's something that would have been unthinkable under the Taliban's first rule. I'll have to specify, I guess we'll see what happens now. But at the time, it also would have been unthinkable in many rural areas, since the US promoted reforms, even when legally mandated, often didn't extend to tribal and conservative areas. So the gains were strong, and many women have risen to the challenge presented by the Taliban rulers who have again taken control. I will mention some current events now, because we've had dozens of protests taking place, unfortunately, often violently broken up. And if you remember Dr. Sarabi, the vice president candidate I mentioned in the beginning of my remarks, she was actually part of the team of negotiators in Qatar for talks with the Taliban before the movement took over Kabul. And she's now living in Turkey because she can't go home for fear of reprisals. She discussed this on an interview with BBC recently. So, women's rights have made gains, and I think that that's something that is not going to go away easily. So I mentioned that as a lifestyle change. I'm just checking the time here. I also wanted to talk about access to education for both boys and girls, which has improved significantly over the last 20 years. Although this is also an area with stark differences depending on the circumstances. These statistics are telling. Nearly 40% of girls were enrolled in secondary school in 2018, and that's compared with 6% in 2003. That's according to UNICEF. But there's still a huge gender gap. Obviously, girls still made up 60% of the 3.7 million Afghan children who were out of school. And an estimated 37% of teenage girls can read and write, compared with 66% of boys, according to Human Rights Watch. And overall enrollments were low, especially low in the poorest and most rural areas. So I should also note that, not everything changed, because at the elementary school level, boys and girls continued to be taught in separate classes, and girls had rules about what they could wear, as did boys. Although coeducation was allowed at the university level. The Taliban did make a recent statement that girls could still attend school and they could attend university, but they can no longer attend classes with boys at university. And there will be a dress code. That's according to a recent reports. So I'd also like to, after talking about those advances, there were also children who got lucky breaks, thanks to the presence of so many foreigners, including journalists, aid workers, government and military officials, etc. I'll talk about one 14-year-old boy who was discovered by an American director while peddling maps and other trinkets on Chicken Street, which is a rickety but popular, well, I should say was, I haven't been there in a while, popular shopping area. His name was Fawad Mohammadi, and he's famous because he ended up co-starring in a movie about two penniless young boys who are best friends and dream of becoming professional players of buzkashi, which is a crazy and dangerous game that somewhat resembles polo, but with a goat's carcass. The film was nominated for an Oscar in the Best Live Action Short Film category in 2013. It didn't win, but the boys were flown to Los Angeles for the ceremony. Fawad, who learned to speak English while hustling foreigners on Chicken Street, told me he was excited to meet some famous actors, and he's now apparently attending Oberlin College on a scholarship. So there were lots of good news stories over the past 20 years, but I should mention the bad news, and the problems that continue to occur and that perhaps were even exacerbated with the US presence. For one thing, there was a lot of corruption. Some experts say that the problem was, the US approach to Afghanistan was centralized, and Afghanistan has so many factions that it's difficult to have a singular ruler, until the Taliban took over control, of course. So there were still a lot of problems. The country remains one of the poorest in the world, poorest countries in the world, sorry. And this is despite some, by some estimates, $1 trillion being spent for US efforts in the country. And that includes reconstruction funds. Opium, the production and trade in opium is a major source of income that has been used for Taliban operations in past years. At least the infant mortality rate dropped by 50% from the previous Taliban time, and maternal mortality rates remain among the world's highest. And there's unlikely to be improvement soon since the healthcare apparatus has deteriorated, with many nurses and doctors not being paid for months. UNICEF has said that more than 18 million people, including nearly 10 million, need humanitarian assistance. So a lot of problems remain. And with the recent events, we have already at least 2.7 million Afghans displaced to foreign countries, and obviously thousands left recently after the Taliban seized control of Kabul. So, I personally wonder about a brain drain. All of these people that the Americans trained and that got this education, a lot of them fled, and I'm sure will try to help their country from afar. But there are a lot of unanswered questions as we move forward. So I just wanted to share a little bit with you about what I experienced in Afghanistan, but I'm going to stop there because I want to give people an opportunity to ask questions. So I hope that helped.
Thank you very, very much, Kim, Ms. Gamble, and everyone who has spoken today. I am very, very interested in all of these presentations. We have one question in the chat from Mark Jason Gilbert, and it is addressed to the whole framing, well, at least the quote that I used to introduce this colloquium. And so I just want to speak to that and then move on to other questions people might have. We are at the end of our planned time, but if people still have time, please do stay on. I can stay on for another half hour at least. So my response here to this question, which I'll read out: most American scholars address the history of Afghanistan via the lens of American intervention. The mention of the journal Foreign Affairs and possible lessons learned about the fall of Kabul is precisely the approach taken after the fall of Saigon, which focused on the failures of Western policy rather than indigenous history and local agency, and of course had no effect on deterring further Western interventionism. As someone steeped in Hawaiian history, the Vietnam conflict, and connected to Afghanistan since 1973, I am sad that we must begin with the powerlessness of the indigenous Afghan people rather than as agents in their own history, as Dr. Weir does. The history of Afghanistan and Islam in its South Asian context, as revealed in its Deobandi roots, and the reality of Taliban ambitions in a frontier on the Indus are the kind of questions the center might address, while educating the public from an American perspective. So the importance of Afghan agency and the importance of looking at Afghan life in the everyday was something that I very much wanted to focus on in this colloquium. And so I appreciate all those of you who have done so well in introducing with the quote from an Afghan scholar, Ajmal Ahmadi, who was the head of Afghanistan's central bank for the past 11 years. I can see how the end words of that quote, where he says that Afghan citizens who had no say in these matters are going to bear the consequences, could definitely be interpreted as de-emphasizing Afghan agency. But as an Afghan himself, I think what he in the whole entire article was referring to is those who didn't consciously involve in politics are tired of being run over by those Afghans who do consciously involve in politics and the foreign interventions that have been going on, especially for the last 40 years. So that was the context which I was trying to put forth, and please forgive me for doing not as good of a job as I intended to, but I agree with all of that criticism, so thank you. Do we have questions from those of you who are attending? If anyone wants to keep formulating one, I want to ask a question to everyone, which is a question about one thing that all of you addressed regarding the importance of education. So I guess it's not so much a specific question as what do you think of the role of education or the future prospects for education now, like the role of education and how Afghans might currently be responding to current events, or how things may progress if you feel like you have grounds to speculate?
And just like Kim, said, the King Amanullah Khan and his wife, Queen Suraya, herself, she came from a highly educated family. Her father, Mahmoud Tarzai, who started, by the way, the first Afghan newspaper, Sirajul Akhbar. An educated person, especially in the Ottoman Empire back then. She, I mean, if you read her sort of biography, short snippets about her, she would strike like the educational queen of Afghanistan, who loved to, create schools everywhere. And that's what she did, especially for young girls. Her husband, educated person, also wanted to do the same thing, create university here and college there, a school there. And so both became very much, involved in the educating their people. And unfortunately that, happened to be the main cause of, being kicked out of the country. Well, both had to leave because there was an insurrection started by Mullah Shorbazar and other religious leaders. And the British also did not really like him because he was the father, the king, the main person who started the Third Anglo-Afghan War in 1919. And so he wanted to retake some of the Pashtun areas on the other side of the Duran line. So they got rid of him, and he died in Italy, broken heart and all that. And so this education, if you go outside Kabul, you would see people like stuck as they are truly in the time of Jesus Christ. That's the latest, modern time for them. But still, honestly, if you ask the most uneducated person in the village what he would like for his children, the same thing that you would get the answer to anywhere in the world. I want them to have good life, not like me suffering. Look at this thing, look at my life. I want them to have education, become doctors, engineers, lawyers, and teachers, and that's exactly what my parents were. Both completely uneducated, but morely my mom educated on the religious side more. And what she wanted was to go to, college and then to university, and she would call it university, in the Pashto language. And so that's every mom, every father in the village, they love to see their children educated because education is the key to, salvation, I would say. And there is that emphasis, if not secondary education, as both, especially Jimmy referred to, the students would go to Pakistan, to get, at least madrasa education that would give us Taliban. I was part of it in the 1960s when I was growing up. My religious education started in my father's mosque, madrasa, and I went to the secular school also, where you do your grades and all that, and high school, up to the high school. I went both school, the secular school as well as the madrasa. So, and I, with the express order of my father to become the mullah of his mosque, which I did for some time, but my mother did not agree with him. And so when he died, she was in charge. He said, no, you go to college. I said, yes, mom. So I went to college, and that's education is. Everybody loves it. And more so now, I believe, than ever before. And there are so many opportunities, and I believe in the 20 years, United States, okay, well, everybody can say complete to collapse and failed, but United States arranged for a lot of schools and colleges. And I think any American, would be proud of it. how much education in these 20 years while the bombs were also dropping, but at the same time, the books were springing up, schools, children going to school. I think that's the greatest thing that the American legacy is, in that country. You can call it failure. I don't see it that failure, And so a lot of good stuff has happened, especially education.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. Does anyone else have a response more about education?
Well, I mean, I would just say, that we hope that that legacy continues and that those schools will be maintained, and that women and girls, as well as men and boys, will be able to attend them, even if there may be restrictions that weren't there before. And the US certainly is invested in somehow trying to make sure that they continue. But like I said, I am concerned about the brain drain. A lot of people, including probably teachers who were scared to stay, may have left, but I think time will tell, and let's hope.
Yeah, I'd just add, I mean, following what Karim said as well, the degree to which people mention the importance of education, I'm repeating, but in interviews that was not about education. I did not bring it up. It wasn't what I was asking about, just was always deeply impressive. And the respect that people show to teachers is beautiful, I think. I mean, I also say, as others have said, there is a kind of an elite of Afghans who, over the past 20 years, have an understanding of the world that is far more sophisticated than existed previously, who were deeply involved, often in the government or NGOs, and they're still around. A lot of them left. One of the real unfortunate things that happened throughout the war and now, the educated people did not work for the government. They were working for foreigners because they paid vastly more. So you had the best people not with the Afghan government for the most part, certainly the young ones. So I have a lot of hope in this small group that really have a fairly sophisticated understanding of the world. And an appreciation for the desire for education. I feel like somehow this long period of conflict, one of the things many people just hungered for is the stability that's required to go to school for an extended period of time so that you progress. And there are people around who have, the knowledge to impart valuable things. But I'm a little bit concerned. I mean, Taliban or Taliban means religious student. So I also don't want to just go, it depends on who's teaching who to what ends. It's not just like there's just some, thing out there and then I mean, it does help to read. I tend to think Afghans are very sophisticated thinkers given their limited means to information and resources. Yeah, hope that this is felt so strongly, concern that many of the most educated left or were never involved with the government. And uncertainty, like when we say it, I kind of want to know what kind of education, to what ends, by whom, for what purposes, because I don't think it's an innocuous thing. I think it depends on how it's done and by who.
I was wondering if I could just jump in as well. So I'm actually an Afghan immigrant woman myself, and the importance of education from, like, I guess my experiences would be that, and understanding the context of Afghanistan, like you said, we had centuries of war and intervention through other countries and the lack of stabilization of the country. So I feel like going even back to, like, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think over time, it's always, the people of Afghanistan have always been at the survival mode, when they're still at that survival mode of wanting the safety needs and psychological needs. Whereas I think a lot of people do want to have education to be able to be at that self-actualization mode of progressing, like that the West have been able to do over the years because they've had the monetary or the space or the agency to be able to do that and to actually discover that. And that's why you can see a lot of the Afghans who do immigrate and move out to the West have those opportunities to be able to take that place. But a lot of the Afghans who are, I guess, in Afghanistan still, or were there most majority of their times, were never given that opportunity to actually utilize education to be able to empower themselves and question things. And that goes back to, again, like what kind of education were they receiving? It was a bit based on, again, like I know Afghanistan has always been like one of those, I guess, and I can say this, a country that has a lot of misogynistic history. And is it passing down that constant cultural information, or allowing, you know, women to step up and question things for themselves, to liberate their own choices and decisions, other than just listening to what centuries and centuries of what the Southeast Asian culture has been. So I think that's probably why one of the biggest, I guess, hungers for education has been looking at literally to get out of survival mode, which I know for a lot of like Afghans, it takes a while. And even like going through PTSD for like immigrating over to the West, it takes a huge shock to the system.
Zara, thank you so much for your thoughts. Thank you for speaking up. It's wonderful that you could join us today.